Now, for more insight on the U.S.-China trade war and the ongoing progress or lack of progress there, we're joined by Milken Institute chief economist William Lee in Washington, D.C. William, thanks for coming on. And you heard the news we were just discussing that the two sides are going to meet in October. What do you think might come out of that?
I think this is the best hope we've got to have some kind of a truce, or the beginnings of a truce that leads to an agreement. And the reason I say that is because October 1st is the 70th anniversary of the Chinese Revolution. At that point, I'm sure that Xi Jinping is going to want to make sure the hardliners have nothing to worry about in terms of they're giving away too much. But at the same time, they want to bring something home to their people and say, we've got the U.S. where we want them. We are now the top country in the world. And I think that incentive on the part of the Chinese is something that we in the U.S. have ignored. We keep talking about President Trump's election schedule and how he has to have something by November of next year. But the Chinese also have a very clear mandate that they want to have a good celebration on October 1st.
And William, it's interesting you use the word truce. I have noticed sort of anecdotally how much fewer people are talking about a deal. Might we get a deal? We've obviously lowered the bar on what we expect a deal to be. And now I hear you using the word truce. It's funny. I think the expectations have really changed for what would even satisfy people. Everyone has lowered what their best case scenario to hope for in terms of what an agreement, truce, deal, whatever word you want to use, might actually look like at this point between the U.S. and China.
Let me define what I think a truce is going to look like. For President Trump, a truce will be to have agreements on ag, agreements on industrial products, more cars being bought, more Caterpillar tractors, and more importantly, more Boeing airlines. For the Chinese, the truce is going to be that they want the tariffs off the table, or at least delayed. And I think that's the compromise that President Trump is going to try to get out of these guys, to have elements of that ag agreement and industrial agreement in place first. The reason why is because President Trump's electoral vote is going to come from the industrial states and also the farm states. The intellectual property and more difficult elements of a real treaty are going to have to be negotiated afterwards, because that's going to take time. And let's face it, it's going to help California, and it's unlikely that he's going to get California in his electoral vote basket.
Although, William, we've heard in the past that perhaps President Trump wants to keep the tariffs on, even with the deal, to act as an enforcement mechanism for any deal. But I want to ask you about the Hong Kong protests, because we know that the government there withdrew that extradition bill that really sparked a lot of the trouble there. And I'm wondering if that gives China's President Xi Jinping less leverage in negotiating with the U.S., because it kind of appears as though the government there sort of succumbed to the pressure from the protests.
Well, I think the Hong Kong protests have two elements to it. For the Chinese, they want to make sure that there's nothing marring their celebration. So they're going to want to make sure that there are no active rioters and the kind of violence that we've seen there. They've always accepted Hong Kong as a source of protests and democratic protests, because in the agreement with the British until 2049, they're supposed to be an SAR, a special administrative region. They're supposed to be given special privileges. Now, for the U.S., the importance of Hong Kong is whether or not China will live up to agreements. And if they actually renege on that agreement with the British, that is, they make that 50-year period into a 25-year period and start putting in extradition bills, that's going to be a very clear sign that the negotiators will say to them, we can't trust you to honor agreements. So I think Hong Kong works both ways in sense of giving us leverage, but also giving the Chinese a source of pride in saying we are able to tolerate democratic protests. And that's the delicacy of having to negotiate with the Hong Kong protesters. They've taken away the extradition bill, yes, but they've also said we're not allowing you universal suffrage.
You know, as we see it, these two world leaders, you've got President Trump and the Chinese president on the other side, battle it out with this trade war. Where does that leave American companies? What's the best strategy for them to navigate this, as obviously they still want to maintain their ties with China and also tap into the huge consumer market there?
Great question. And that really is the essence of dealing with China. We know that the supply chain that concentrates on China is just a little bit too risky, because it's putting all the eggs in one basket. We also know that President Trump's strategy is to try to carve up that huge bilateral deficit that we have with the Chinese, and to be able to forge new bilateral trade ties in a way that shifts the supply chain out of China toward our new trading partners. So the U.S. trade strategy really is to try to diversify away from China as a source for our goods and services. For the Chinese, the new trade strategy is to try to become much more of a globalist and to try to expand their network. And that's why they, for example, initiated the Belt and Road strategy to get more countries to trade with them. So for us, I think our whole trade outlook is going to be one that is restructuring the post-World War II trade agreements away from these multilateral agreements toward a series of bilateral agreements that forges new trade ties to shift the jobs in a way that U.S. acquires more high-value manufacturing. The other manufacturing jobs go toward the other countries in our U.S. Trade union.
All right, William Lee of the Milken Institute, thanks so much for joining us. Good stuff.
Thanks for having me.